Hello and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Syria, a civil war within, and the deadly reality of seeing this conflict spill over into the entire region. Does much of the blame for the current situation lay with foreign countries seeing an opportunity to eliminate an enemy in Damascus? If so, what are the unintended consequences? Crosstalk to Syria, Turkey Tinderbox. I'm joined by Mark Aumann in London. He is a modern history lecturer at the University of Oxford. Also in London, we have Fadi Hahoura. He is an expert on Turkey and an associate fellow at Chapman House. And in Tampa, we cross to Majid Rafizadeh. He is an Iranian-Syrian expert and visiting scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Okay, Mark, if I can go to you first in London, we're told from Turkey the worst-case scenario is being played out. Of course, that means war between the two countries. How close are we to that? Or is that just rhetoric right now?
Well, I think when you can say it's the worst, as we know from Shakespeare, the worst is not yet. And I'm afraid I think things could get a great deal worse. The illusion is perhaps that if a powerful military state like Turkey intervened, it would produce a collapse of the Assad regime quickly, and this would then produce peace. I'm not so sure that would happen. I think there are complications. Yes, the Turkish army and air force is much more powerful than a Syrian army that is sorely stretched fighting a rebellion. But on the other hand, whether you would pacify the country or simply produce new tensions, including tensions with, after all, the old imperial power, Turkey, I think is really open to question. And if we think about past precedents, 30 years ago, the Israelis entered Lebanon to suppress the PLO. Yeah, and yet, they were greeted by people in the south as liberators from the PLO, from the Palestinians who were disliked by the Shiites. But a few months later, the Shiites decided they didn't like their Israeli liberators, and that runs to the present day. So there's always a danger that you can intervene to act as the liberator, only to discover that the people who you liberated turn out not to be grateful.
Okay, I'd like to talk about the NATO element a little bit later. Father, do you think that the Turks really want to go this far, or do you think that they're going to have their Western allies backing them up, okay? Empty rhetoric again, even though we do have shells going over the border.
The Turkish public opinion, according to recent opinion polls, is increasingly against their government's Syria policy. At the same time, also, I think the Turkish government does not want to enter into the Syrian quagmire, at least, or get militarily involved, unless it's Washington, and principally here Washington, is behind them. And so far, we can see an incredible reticence in Washington not to get involved in the civil war in Syria.
Okay, but Fadi, if I can stay with you, I mean, Turkey is very much involved in this civil war. It has an open border. We have people going back and forth. It's playing an active role in this civil war.
There is no doubt that Turkey is involved. Turkey is hosting the Free Syrian Army. There are also reports that that money, weapons are being funneled through Turkey to the Syrian armed opposition. So Turkey is in the thick of things. Turkey has been trying to unify a very, very fragmented Syrian opposition, so far to little success. But sending troops, Turkish troops, over the border into Syria is a whole different dimension.
Okay, Majid, if I go back to you in Tampa, do you think the Syrians want the Turks to blink? Because they know NATO doesn't really want to get involved in this, at least overtly. It's a bluff.
Well, yeah, that's a good question, Peter. But let me just go back to your previous question. I would agree with your friend, with the other guest from Turkey. I think Syria is some sort of potential Vietnam for Turkey. I don't think Turkey would want to intervene in Syria militarily, for now at least, because intervening in Syria militarily would get Turkey sucked into Syria, sucked into a sectarian war in Syria, and that would backlash in Turkey because of the issue of the Kurds might rebel against Turkey, might unify with the Kurds in Syria. And also, there would be a proxy war between Iran. We should also bring Iran into the topic, because there would be, Iran has a large stake inside Syria, and there will be Saudi also intervening in Syria, and there is international superpowers who are backing the Assad regime. So I don't think Turkey now ready to intervene militarily in Syria. And as your guest said, I think I don't think the public opinion in Turkey are in favor of any war that launching against Syria.
Mark, how did we get to this point here in the broader picture? Because a year and a half ago, Turkey had almost an idyllic foreign policy. It didn't really have a lot of problems with a lot of people at all. Maybe the Kurds, but everybody else had a pretty reasonable foreign policy. Now it has the worst foreign policy in the region.
Yeah, it's a peculiar situation that the government suddenly and impulsively stood on its head and somersaulted into radical opposition to governments that it had previously cultivated. The Prime Minister, Mr. Erdogan, had received a prize from Gaddafi for promoting human rights, seemed to be trying to edge Libya towards better relations with the outside world through economic and diplomatic contacts, similarly with Syria. Then came this dramatic shift, and I think a big problem for the Turkish government is that it expected the wave of revolution to spread very quickly and largely peacefully. In a sense, what had happened in Tunisia and Egypt would carry on. We saw Libya took a long time to resolve, if it's resolved now. And of course, Syria has turned out to be a much tougher nut to crack for the reasons that your contributors have also discussed. There are deep-rooted rivalries. There isn't a clash simply between a narrow dictatorship and the people. The people in Syria are divided, and some of that division spreads over the borders, not just Kurds. Remember, we often talk about Assad's regime being an Alawite-based regime. Well, there are many more Alevis in Turkey than in Syria. And one problem for the Turkish government, I think, is any intervention, any threat of intervention even, begins to bring to the surface sectarian divisions which really had been silent inside Turkey for 70 years. And so there is a danger that even inside Turkey itself, you begin to get a Sunni Alawi clash, you begin to clash.
I want to talk about the sectarian differences a little bit later. Fadi, you know, the worst case scenario for me is that everyone's given up on Syria and now it is just a proxy war. And that means it could turn into another Lebanon, okay? Because there doesn't seem to be any will on the part of the rebels to negotiate. They've given up on that. They just want, you know, as much violence and see who wins, hopefully with a Western intervention of some form. That's the worst case scenario.
I think there is even a even more worse scenario, and that's the fact that if outside powers start really funneling weapons and material to the
I would make the argument they
sides,
are. They already are doing that.
Still, it looks limited. But if, for example, Mitt Romney becomes president of the United States, and he stated yesterday very clearly that the United States will be actively, should he become president, he will be actively providing weapons to the Syrian Sunni armed groups, then things, I think, will get a lot worse, because then I don't think Moscow will be silent. They will be providing further weaponry, or more sophisticated weaponry to the Assad regime. And similarly, Iran will not sit quiet, and perhaps even Iraq. So far, to a certain extent, the Syria conflict has been contained somewhat, like Lebanon was in the 1980s. But should the different parties really get far more active in the conflict, and I think it could get a lot worse, not just for Syria, but for the neighbors, including Turkey.
Okay, Majid, what do you think about that? Because there's a plethora of information that you have. The Saudis and the Kuwaitis, they're full blast, doing as much as they can to help the rebels, okay? Is it making the situation worse or better? I think I know your answer. Go ahead.
Well, okay, Peter. Well, I think the Syrian case, I would argue that, Peter, it's very similar to Lebanon, but with Syria is very complicated, and the reason is that there are three concentric forces of conflict at the same time, simultaneously are working. First, we have the domestic, the opposition groups, the rebel fighting the regime, and none of them can defeat the other one. And then we have the regional Cold War between Iran, as you mentioned, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab Gulf states, and also some religious, you can say, Cold War between Shiism and Sunnism. And then we have on the international level also there is the deadlock between Russia, China, and the other side, the United States, France, and Germany, and other European countries. So I think because of these three levels, you see that it's resolving the crisis in Syria is very, very complicated.
Yeah, Majid, if I could stay with you, but I mean, how many people in Syria want to resolve it? And I'm looking at the rebels, okay? They've walked away from negotiations.
Well, I think we can say that majority of Syrian people want, they're looking for a peaceful transition. And
oh, come on,
I think this
we're
is
way
obvious.
beyond that now. We're way beyond that now. Don't you agree?
I'm talking about ordinary people, but let me say, when we have a 19-month conflict, definitely when there is violence, when there is weapon is used by first, I can say, by both sides, or first it was initiated by the regime, I think you would have some sort of radicalized group or Islamist group coming into the field. I think that. Well, when there is instability, you will see that jihadis coming inside, or other group trying to spoil the situation. And I think probably you're referring to those limited groups. But I think we can't generalize that to the all ordinary Syrian people who really just want a peaceful transition. They want stability inside the country, and they want a democratic country, and they want to elect their own leader and their own government, and they want to have their own.
Okay, well, I mean, we're way away from that. Mark, before we go to the break here, has the international community, the major powers, given up on a Syria that is, as we know it today? Is it just a proxy now?
Well, it is a proxy conflict, certainly, and the other problem is the international community doesn't exist. We have radically opposed views. Essentially, Russia and China, if you like, are the conservative countries who don't want outside powers to foster revolution. In the West, not least in the United States, we have radical voices who often present themselves as conservative, but who really want to turn over the Middle Eastern cart and see what comes crawling out from underneath, whether it will be better or not. Partly because these great powers are a long way away, and so they can mess up without actually having to take responsibility. The big problem for countries like Turkey, Jordan, Iran and so on is, if this does descend into a regional conflict, they can't walk away. They are next door.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria's civil war. Stay with RT. Okay, I'd like to go back to Fadi in London. You know, I find it really quite curious, if not hypocritical, that a lot of Western media criticizes Syria for violating Turkey's territory and sovereignty, but it's Syria's territory and sovereignty that's being violated all the time. But no one likes to talk about that. Go ahead.
I think it's quite normal in the Middle East to have double and triple standards, but that's something usual. In the case of, for example, Turkey normally complained that the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or the PKK, which is currently located in the mountains of northern Iraq, infiltrated into Turkey, and used to complain about that to Iraq, and especially the Iraqi Kurdish leadership, quite substantially. Now we see that Turkey is hosting the Free Syrian Army and helping them to carry out attacks inside Syria against the Assad regime. So we always see these double standards take place in the region. That is normal, and that's to be expected.
Well, Fadi, should American and Western foreign policy be based on double and triple standards, if you think it's true? And I agree with you.
I think that foreign policy is based on national strategic interests. And what the United States and Europe are doing is in their strategic interests. Similarly, Russia is acting in its strategic interests, and China, and the other powers around the world. So what matters is national strategic interests, and then it's up to the
I agree with you.
countries.
So what is Saudi Arabia's national interest here? Explain to me. To spread jihadism?
I think that there is increasingly a sectarian dimension to foreign policy in the region, whether it's Turkey and its regional Arab allies. That's quite evident. But each country acts in its strategic interests. Unfortunately, those strategic interests are clashing, and we're seeing the consequences in Syria.
Okay, Majid, what do you think about that? Okay, whose national interests are being served here? Okay, what are American national interests here?
Well,
freedom and democracy.
We're talking about. I'm talking. There is two things. I think there is when talking about. I'm just going back to the Turkey. When talking about there is national honor and there is national interest. I mean, Turkey's national honor is that when it's let's say attacked by Syria, when its jet was shut down by Syria, it wants to show that it's protecting its own people, and it will send its army to the border. But there is national interest. There is when if they intervene in Syria, and if Syria turned into a protracted or long civil war for years, then they would have to take responsibility for that. And there is also I would mention there is also the economic dimension to this. If Turkey intervened in Syria, and that would damage its economy, that might spoil its reputation among the Arab street also. So I think this dimension of national interest sometimes coalesce with the national honor of the country.
Okay, Mark, well, how much is Iran playing in this here? I mean, the United States and Saudi Arabia. Again, Syria is a proxy. It's a way to get something done, okay? They don't care about the Syrian people. I'm sorry, they don't.
Well, they have their own interests, and one aspect is, if you like, the religious ideological common interest, that you have a Shiite crescent, if you like, running from Lebanon through Syria, particularly into Iraq, and then on to Iran, and also down to places like Bahrain and eastern Saudi Arabia. And there is a kind of religious civil war. It's not just a war between democrats and dictators, but there is also a Sunni-Shiite conflict. And therefore, there is the danger of a wider war. And I think Iraq is in some ways even more sensitive here than Iran. Iraq is, after all, the funnel for any serious help that goes from Iran through to Syria. Iraq has a common border, has common airspace. And we have this irony: the United States, actually George Bush did produce democracy in Iraq. It's just that 60% of Iraqis didn't vote for what George Bush, or for that matter Barack Obama, wanted. Now we see the very same people who were fighting against the Americans are actually helping to organize both bombings in Baghdad and in other parts of Iraq, but also, of course, helping the anti-Assad forces.
Fadi,
and we're in a sense going back to this very cynical world of Afghanistan in the 1980s. I think more than Lebanon, even Afghanistan is the representative of a proxy war. The same kind of jihadi, Saudi-funded and equipped people that the Americans brought into Afghanistan, their children are now going to Syria. And I'm afraid to say Turkey, for instance, is becoming the Pakistan of this war. And that's not a very happy position for Turkey to be, from going from being candidate for the EU to becoming the Pakistan on the edge of the EU.
Okay, Mark, if I can stay with you, I mean, just to be clear here, Saudi Arabia isn't exporting democracy.
No.
No. Okay.
Certainly not importing it either.
Okay. Fadi, what do you think about that? I mean, the regional dynamics here, because, you know, the unintended consequences, Iraq, Lebanon, I mean, they're being pulled into this. They don't want to be, but they are.
No doubt there are regional consequences, but I do detect a slight difference between the 1980s, the era of the war in Afghanistan and Lebanon, and today. I think today you can see that Arabs generally are exhausted with all this conflict. Arab public opinion in general may be against the Assad regime, but is not in favor of any military involvement in Syria. Similarly, in Turkey, the Turkish public opinion is deeply against military involvement in Syria. So we don't see that kind of excitement or that kind of agitation.
Well, Fadi, but at the same time, you have the friends of Syria saying Assad must go. Okay, it's almost a cheer you're hearing right now. How do you know? There's a difference here between what the street believes and certain vested interests.
I think that we have to distinguish two things. One is diplomatic condemnation and actually taking active policies to depose the Assad regime. Beyond economic sanctions and diplomatic condemnation, we don't see Western powers really doing much to overthrow the Assad regime. In addition, I would also add that Israel is not preoccupied with Syria at all. It's mostly preoccupied with the Iranian nuclear program. You barely hear any comments from the Israeli government on the current events in Syria.
Okay. Well, maybe they're just preoccupied with Iran. Majid, what do you think about that? I mean, even if Assad goes, what changes in Syria? No one ever talks about that scenario. Go ahead.
I think that one of the important is the regional aspects. If we have a proxy war in Syria, this is the worst scenario. I think Iran is a masterful of making proxies in countries. It made the proxy in Lebanon when there was a civil war in Lebanon. We had Hezbollah. It created a proxy in Iraq when there was an instability, Al-Mahdi. And I think if there would be some sort of instability, decentralized government in Syria, Iran definitely will make a proxy with the Alawite inside Syria. And I think that's the worst scenario that we can see. But again, back to your question about what will happen if Assad goes. I think first we know that this regime has lost its legitimacy and its credibility. So there is no doubt that
everybody in Syria. Let's keep that in mind, gentlemen. Not everybody in Syria feels that way. Go ahead, Majid.
Well, Well, we can argue that majority of the people, they want a more democratic system of governance. I mean, either they're afraid of saying that,
well, in a country that has a civil war, it's pretty hard to figure out what public opinion is. Mark, you said you wanted to jump in and mention something about Israel. Go right ahead.
Well, I think Majid's point that Israel's been rather quiet on this is quite revealing because, after all, Assad's regime hasn't been a big problem for the Israelis, not since 1982. Whereas we've seen with Egypt, the change in Egypt has brought big problems on their border, and it's not impossible to imagine that, from the point of view of the Israelis at any rate, a more Muslim Brotherhood-influenced regime, let alone a jihadi-type regime in Damascus, could be a much bigger problem, and could therefore be a much more destabilizing element. One question is here, we're discussing two different things, aren't we? What is in the interests of international peace, and what is in the interests of a notional majority in Syria, what they would like to have? As you say, we don't really know what Syrians want, because the violence means that basically the people doing the fighting are the people who will decide, whoever wins will decide what the future is going to be. And sadly, in this kind of civil war, it's happened endlessly throughout history, the winners decide what the people want, and the people, if they're wise, back the winner.
Fadi, who is winning in this civil war, internally and externally? Give me a scorecard.
I think that,
go ahead.
I would say it's essentially a stalemate. The Assad regime is unable to completely defeat the Sunni armed opposition. On the other hand, the Sunni armed opposition is unable to overthrow Assad. At the same time, we can see that Moscow is keeping Washington in check. We can see also regionally that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar and Turkey are keeping Iran in check, and vice versa. So it's essentially a stalemate. I think that this conflict, it looks likely to drag on until exhaustion comes into play.
Okay, Fadi, so you're saying the biggest losers so far are the Syrian people, because outside forces are arming rebels.
I think that the biggest losers are the Arabs in general. The Arabs have been suffering from repeated wars in the region, from the 1980s, the Lebanese Civil War, the Iraqi wars in the 1990s, and now we have this. So the Arabs are continuously being undermined by these regional conflicts, undermining their prospects for democracy, for economic prosperity. And until these regional wars stop, the Arabs will continue to suffer, not just the Syrians, but also the Lebanese, the Iraqis, now the Turks, and the Arabs more generally.
Majid, what's the next step in your mind? Where should it go? Because there should be, it can only be a negotiated peace. Negotiated peace. Go ahead, Majid, go ahead.
I think one of the most important things first, we have to really create some humanitarian corridors. We have to create some bigger refugee camps, either in Lebanon or in Jordan or in Turkey, just to allow the people who are fleeing Syria and they're fleeing this violence, just to be able to have a shelter. I think this is the first thing that we have to do. And then I think here Turkey can play an important role in trying to convince the oppositional groups, unify the opposition groups to have a consistency message, and then to reach an agreement to have some sort of transitional government where Assad step aside. But this is again goes back.
I'm going to jump in here, Mark. I'm going to give you the last word in the program. 20 seconds. Go ahead.
I'm afraid the international community, Turkey lost its opportunity to be an honest broker and a mediator, and now unfortunately we have dishonest brokers, arms suppliers, and, if you like, the indifferent. And the balance between those is going to decide who wins on the ground.
Very depressing note. Many thanks today to my guests in London and in Tampa, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
What?